Good morning, Grove. It's so good to worship with you on this beautiful May morning. And we miss you on our campus, but it's not going to be too much longer, I don't think. So if you're just joining us, we're wrapping up a series today that we've titled The Way of Jesus. And it's a series in which we've been talking about spiritual formation, what it takes to grow spiritually. And we've talked about how we form spiritually through our minds, intellectually. There's a relational component to our spiritual growth. We talked about how there's an affective component, how we have this heart for God. Today, I want to end by talking about how there is a doing component to our spirituality. There is a volitional component to it. There are things that we are called to do. For example, knowing God, our spirituality is not just about what we know intellectually. It's not just about our feelings, but there are certain actions that we are called to take. There are things that we are called to do. That's why I say there's a doing component. Jesus' brother James, he says it like this. He says, do not merely listen to the words of God, but do them. He says, I'll show you my faith by what I do. Here's the things about our doing is that our actions, the things we do in this life, they lead to who we become. So it's very important, the things that you give your life to doing, be very careful about those things because it leads to who you are. When you think about how do we learn things, what shapes us, how do we develop as people, we normally think that happens in a classroom, right? It's called formal education, which would include teachers, lectures, exams, quizzes, handouts, papers, term papers. But here's the thing. Educators are now realizing that maybe the most effective means of learning is by experience. It's called experiential learning. Because if you think about it, formal education, its weaknesses, it's isolated and insulated from everyday life. But the things that we do, those experiences, they actually begin to shape us and change us. Some say it like this. Maybe you've heard the phrase, experience is life's best teacher. I think it's true. I've seen it happen. This is one of the reasons that Paul Gunther and I lead local and global missions experiences, because we go to make change in places and show people Christ. But also it creates change in our people who go to serve. For example, a little while ago, we're having a dinner here at the Grove, and I'm coming through the dinner line with my plate, and I'm hungry. And this sweet woman, Mary, is serving the food, and it's rice. And I'm a connoisseur of rice. I'm an aficionado of rice, any rice dish. I love rice. And so she gives me some rice, and I look at my plate, and I'm like, no, Mary, you got to do better than that. That's not enough for a third grader. And she said, Palmer, I quit heaping plates with food after Malawi. She said, you know what happened in Malawi. And she's right. I remembered that summer we had been in Malawi with a huge crowd from the Grove. And on one afternoon, I took about 20 people to Msliza. Msliza is this shanty town on the edge of Lilongwe near African Bible College. And my good friend Chris Clark, through his organization, Children of the Nations, leads a feeding program there. They also have orphanages all over Malawi and Africa, but they had a feeding program. And so I took people to help with the feeding program. And so Mary had been helping to put food on the kids' plates. And the people who led the program had showed them how much food to put on the plate. But Mary and the others from the Grove, when they started putting food on the kids' plate, they thought, that's not enough. We need to heap and pile on more food. And so they did that. But then they ran out of food. So Mary and the others started yelling for the people to bring more food. And the people who ran the program came in and they said, that's all the food there is. There is no more food. But there's still 60 or 70 kids in line. So Mary and the others said, well, what about those kids? They're hungry. And they said, well, they'll have to come back tomorrow. So Mary and our volunteers from the Grove just started to weep, started to cry. Because we aren't used to running out of food. We aren't used to scarcity. So that's why when I'm coming through the food line and Mary says, I'm not heaping plates anymore. You see, Mary had learned something. She had changed. I could have preached a sermon on global poverty. I could have done a class here at the Grove on extreme poverty and world hunger. But instead, the experience of being in a shanty town in Africa has changed her for life. Do you see why I say the experiences, they change us? The things that we do have a spiritual component to them. They shape us. When you read the Gospels, you see Luke particularly shows us he shows us Jesus' teaching method. When Jesus wanted to teach, he would take the experiences of his learners and show them how they were right or wrong, show them how to live differently using the experiences of his learners. So I want you to open in your Bible with me to Luke chapter 16. And in this series, we're using the different parables of Jesus as our text. And we come to one in Luke chapter 16. He sets it up in verse 14, and then the parable starts in verse 19. Let me start in verse 14. The Pharisees who loved money, wow, underline that, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your heart." Wow, no wonder they wanted to kill him. Verse 19, he tells them this story. There was a certain rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury. Every day at his gate was a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his wounds. The time came when the beggar died and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died, and he was buried in Hades, in hell, where he was in torment. He looked up and he saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me. Send Lazarus to dip his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place." Let's move down to the end of the text. He said to them, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." And Jesus is talking about himself. He says, "I'm going to come back from the dead, and still some of you are not going to believe." But here's the point. He's speaking to these religious leaders, and he's saying to them, you've been in the synagogue your whole life. You know the Torah well, but for you, it's become a facade. It's just a religious show. He said, there are desperate people around you, and you're doing nothing. In other words, there's a doing component to your faith, and you're missing it. And so Jesus' cry to those religious leaders, his listeners, and to us, is to do something. And if you're writing something down this morning, write this down as our key idea, is that God has something in this life for you to do. He has a purpose for your life. And so my question this morning is, have you discovered your God-given, divine purpose, sole purpose in this world? I think because every person wonders, what am I here for? Does my life matter? Does my life have any meaning? And so I want to start with this first idea, this first thought, is that the soul craves purpose. You know this. Your soul, every person's soul, craves purpose. We want meaning. We want to know that the things that we do matter. So the soul craves purpose. I think we all ask this question, what in the world has God put me here for? I think it's because of this that we keep hearing people haunted by this question on social media. They're yelling out in 1,000 different ways, do you see me? Do you hear me? Do I matter? Everybody wants to know that because the soul craves purpose. When our life lacks purpose, we get unwell. We don't do so good. We live aimlessly. We start to spiral into things like anger and worry and fear. But when you find purpose, when you discover your purpose, we live with intentionality. We get up every morning knowing what God wants us to do. That's the difference there. If you don't have purpose, think about this with me, then the desires and the demands of other people, they control your life. If you don't have purpose, then fear drives your life. If you don't have purpose, then problems drive your life. If you don't have purpose, then things that don't matter a cent start to drive your life. And in Jesus' story here, for him, it's luxury and pleasure and money. Things that don't last at all begin to drive this man's life instead of having a God-given purpose. And when you think about it, this story, this parable, I don't think it's so much about the problem or the evil of money. I think it's about the problem of a person who lacks purpose. And so I started by saying the soul longs for purpose. The soul desires purpose. And if that's the case in your life, then it's time to discover your God-given purpose. Have you thought much about that at all? In James chapter 2, verse 18, we'll go back to that text. Jesus' brother says this: one person might say, you have faith, but I do good things. He says, show me your faith apart from the things that you do, and I will show you my faith by the good things that I do. Do you see what he's saying here? There is something here that God has put you to do. You see, God has made you and created you brilliant and beautiful with all kinds of ability and talent. There are some things that you do better than anybody else. There are some passions that you have that nobody else has. And when you put that combination of your passions and your abilities together, you start to see what your purpose is. Because God doesn't waste a moment and God doesn't waste a life. God has something important for you to do. So how do you know what it is that God is calling you to do? How do you know where your purpose is heading? Well, think about this story. You see, he's showing us every day. The Holy Spirit is whispering to you every day, just outside your door, there's a need. Will you meet it? He's telling you that. And so this man in the story keeps ignoring this clear, obvious calling on his life. And Jesus' warning or his implorement is, don't live that same way. As we talk about purpose, I want you to know this morning that you are never too old to discover your purpose if you haven't yet. You're never too young to start living out your purpose. My challenge is right now, start living out your God-given purpose. I think sometimes we underlive the life that God has given us. Sometimes we sell ourselves short and think that we can't do it. I want to say, no, God put you here to make change. God put you here to make a difference in this world. God has stuffed your life filled with meaning. It's time to live that out. It's time to live that way. So how do we discover our purpose? I'll say this first, is that to discovering your purpose will take hard work. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take intentionality. I said it takes hard work. You're not going to fall into your purpose backwards. Maybe there was a point in your life when you thought, okay, maybe this is my purpose, and you started to pursue it. You started to live it. But then it got hard. Maybe it cost you too much time, or it cost too much money, or there were people who were criticizing you. There were skeptics out there saying you couldn't do this, your efforts were too small. You knew that's what God wanted with your life, but then you stopped. And I want to say, don't. Finding your God-given divine purpose, it will take hard work, intentionality, drive. Believe me, it's not going to happen like this. One day you're not going to get a phone call and someone's going to say, hey, we want to pay you piles of money to do what you've always dreamed of doing. No, you have to go after it. God's going to show you the trouble outside your door. And then it's up to you whether you respond to it or not. And I said it's hard work, it's difficult. It may mean that you have to go back to college. It may mean you need to finish the degree. It may mean you need to do some things that you've never done before, speak publicly, go to a place that you've never been. When this quarantine and this virus is over, you may need to travel somewhere new. You may need to pick it all up. I don't know. But it will take hard work and intentionality. Maybe right now in your job, there are things that God wants you to do. And right now in your job, you don't see that. Maybe you think your job is just a paycheck. And I want to say, no, God wants to use you there. And so give yourself fully to it. Become the person that encourages others. Don't stop showing up late to work. Stop showing up to the Zoom meetings in your sweats, because they may need you to lead. In fact, they may one day need you to be the president, lead the whole place of your company. I say that because I saw that happen in my own life once, years back when I was a senior in college. I had just needed some extra money, and so I got a part-time job teaching PE at a Christian school, a junior high school. And I'd been doing that for a while, and then the owner of the school started to give me more responsibility, asking me to sub, asking me to take on some administrative things. And I thought, well, that's fine. I didn't mind the extra work, but I did love the PE part because I thought I was an athlete. And then I graduated. And the week after I graduated, she called me in her office, and she said, Palmer, I want to ask you to be the principal of our school. And I was like, what? And inside I'm going, who, me? I never saw a principal in me. I was 22 years old. Some of her teachers were twice my age. They had been teaching for 20 years. And you want me to be the principal? But she had seen something in my efforts. Unfortunately, I had to say to her, I said, you know what? I have this other part-time job. I'm a junior high intern pastor. I was making $50 a month. And I said to her, I really think I want to go into student ministries. I want to be a youth pastor. So I'm going to have to turn down your offer, as gracious and generous as it was. But my point to you is every day, you have that opportunity to have influence, make an impact in your workplace and do those things. So what is the first step toward finding your purpose? Maybe right now in this quarantine time, your first step is to take action, seize today. Take advantage of this quarantine season, and you know God is pushing you in a direction or has prodded you to start something, then register the domain name. Incorporate with the Arizona Corporate Commission. Form your team. Start meeting on Zoom. Take those first steps. If God is pushing you, maybe this right now is the opportunity you've been waiting for. I said, discovering your soul purpose will take hard work. When you find your soul purpose, it will also get you moving. I know that because when we read this story in Luke chapter 16, one of the big problems is the man in the story, the man in the house was immobile. And I think almost every time God shows us our purpose, he wants to get us up and get us going and get us out. So maybe it's time to get up off the couch. Maybe it's time to get off your iPhone, to get off social media, to get off Netflix. Now, you can't go too far yet because of quarantine, but maybe it's time for you to get ready to move, get ready to go into something brand new. Maybe it means you need to pack your backpack. You're going somewhere. Maybe it's time to renew your passport, get your hydro ready. Clean up, get some boots or clean up your boots. Because I think God uses us best when we're moving. Your divine purpose will probably involve you going somewhere. Maybe it's just going to a person or people outside your home, outside your neighborhood, outside your community. People who are hurting, like this poor, hungry man in Jesus' story. Where can God take you? I'm going to say when you're pursuing his purpose, it can be anywhere. The opportunities are infinite. I want to end with one final thought, and it's this, one final challenge, is that your sole purpose will include doing compassion. I said that there's a doing component to our faith. And so often when we look at Jesus' life and actions, it included doing compassion. So I want to go back to our parable and just remind you of how this story started. Luke chapter 16, verse 19, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury. At his gate was a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. Verse 22, the time came when the beggar died and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man died and he was buried in Hades and hell. That's where he ended up. So in Jesus' story, he shows us two realms, doesn't he? He shows us heaven, where Lazarus ends up, and he shows us hell. These are places based on who we are, what we believe, where we go. Those are eternal conditions. But I think in this story, Jesus also shows us that there are places on earth that are like hell. There are places of hell on earth. There are places where there is a man with sores that the dogs are licking, and the question that Jesus is asking is, what are you doing about that? What are you doing about those places for those kinds of people? And the underlying question is in what way will you spread the kingdom of heaven on earth? In what way will you show people Jesus Christ? In Jesus' parables, he's saying, hey, don't miss it. Places of hell are right outside your door, right outside your neighborhood, right on the other side of the freeway. And so let's be honest, who have you ignored? Who have you failed to pay attention to? I said Jesus was telling this story to the religious leaders of his day. And his point to them was, you know the Torah, you've been to synagogue every week, you know all of these things. But he says, knowing the commandments of God is not enough. And he knew they knew the commandments of God well because they recited them. The Jewish leaders loved their Shema. The Shema is something that they recited every morning at sunrise and every evening at sunset. And it began with the words, love the Lord your God with all your heart. But then Jesus comes along and he edits, he amends, he changes their sacred Shema. And he says, love God. And then he says, love others. That's the challenge. And the whole point of this story, this parable in Luke chapter 16 is you're not loving others. I think so often we can end up the same way. I think there are a lot of people who go to church for years and they're very good at knowing about the Bible. They're very good at saying they love God, but then they can fail at loving others in the same way that Jesus tells this story. I think the good news of Jesus Christ not only changes our eternal condition, not only points us toward heaven for eternity, but the good news of Jesus changes circumstances for people now and forever. I say that not because I took a class in college or during my PhD that taught me that. I haven't read a book that taught me that. I learned it through my life experiences, like I talked about earlier. Watching my parents not just preach the good news, but do the good news. I grew up deep in the Liberian rainforest in West Africa. And every Sunday, we did the same thing. We would walk for dozens of miles, for hours in the sweltering tropical heat, in order for my father to preach the good news. And then in almost every village, hundreds and hundreds of villages, he would give that invitation for people to give their lives to Christ. And so I knew that every week I would watch my parents preach the good news. But then on Monday, I would watch them begin to do the good news. You see, I said Our spirituality has a doing component. On Mondays, I would watch my mother, who had become a nurse in training when we lived in Africa. She would spend her Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays, every day of the week, bandaging tropical ulcers. She would treat all of the babies who they brought in for malaria with chloroquine. She would deliver brand new babies and then try to keep the witch doctors and the medicine men away who wanted to rub their concoction in the baby's navel. And so she would try to protect them from the tetanus and the lockjaw. I would watch my mother on Monday do the good news. She would take a needle, put a match to it, and then dig the chiggers out of my friend's toes. My father, I'd watch him. He would preach the good news on Sunday. Then on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, I watched him build a school, a mission school for the poorest of the poor. And then he built a college. I watched him build a clinic because my mother had too many people to treat. And eventually he builds a hospital. I watched my father build dormitories to rescue girls from the villages who were going to be child brides, to give them an education so they could grow up and thrive and flourish. You see what I'm saying? That the good news is something that we preach and teach, but it's also something that we do. That's why I say our faith has this doing component. So think about this with me. The reason we do not meet a need, like the man in Jesus' story, is not because we are unable to meet the need. It's usually because we are unwilling to meet the need. And Jesus comes along and he wants to break that callousness. He wants to say, see the needs right outside your door and start to do something about them. I think as Christians, at least for me growing up, I usually viewed sin as something we committed, things we did. Like we were always told, don't drink, don't dance, don't cuss, don't lie, all right? And if we did those things, if we committed those things, we were told we were committing sins of commission. When Jesus starts to teach, it seems like he almost talks more about sins of omission, things that we fail to do. So he tells this story in Luke chapter 16, and he's saying to the religious leaders, he said, the rich man in this story, it's what he failed to do. He failed to show compassion and care to the beggar outside his door. In Matthew 25, Jesus goes on this same line of thinking. He says, and he talks about the things that we fail to do, that we do not do. He says, for example, I was thirsty, and you did not give me clean water. He said, I was hungry, and you did nothing to end extreme poverty and help food production. He said, I was in prison, and you could care less. You didn't seem to care much at all about the overpopulation of minority populations in our prisons. He says that I was a stranger. I was a foreigner. I was an immigrant, and you didn't invite me in for your backyard barbecue. He said all of those things. Those are all sins of omission. And then he says this, he shows us this, that our spiritual condition hinges on it. Our eternal state hinges on what we do or do not do for the person outside our door. And that's the whole crux of the story here, is that Jesus draws a straight line between what we do or we do not do about issues of compassion and justice and our spiritual condition. I want to end this morning by reading Micah 6:8. You've heard it if you've been in church. You've maybe heard it your whole life. I'm going to read it this time from the Message Bible, and it reads like this. God has already made it plain how to live, what to do. What God is looking for in men and women is quite simple. Do what is fair and just to your neighbor. Be compassionate and loyal in love. Do you see how Micah says, do these things that I've called you to? That's what I want to see from you. There's this doing component. As I was preparing this message, I couldn't help but think of Josh's song, the after song. This is what we're here for. This is by Josh Havens, Matt Fuquay, Dan Jordan. Thank you for this piece. And I want to read you these words, and I want to invite you to make it your prayer as we close this morning. And Josh writes, this is what we're here for, to give, to love, to be the ones to show that you have overcome the dark, the night, the pain. We fight. You are alive. This is what we're here for, to show the world how to love. This is what we're made for, to lay it all down like you did. When we feel useless, you still use us. Help us not forget. This is what we're here for. Josh, thank you for those words.